Hey guys, Tammy back with you. And I told you last week that I was working on a special guest for you, and I accomplished that. And so this week I'm actually being joined by Thomas's ex-wife, Emily, who is here with me. And I want to say a couple things kind of at the outset here. As you know, I mean, Thomas and we had talked about the possibility of having Emily on as a guest in the past in different episodes, if you guys have been listening for a while. And then obviously recently Thomas passed away. If you don't know that, you can go back a few episodes to an episode called The Tragic Ending, and you can hear the story. I'm not going to repeat it here because, as you can imagine, it's quite emotional for me and Emily both. So it's been difficult. So, the boys Thomas's kids are 18 and 19 now. And so, we've kind of you hit a point where, things get a little easier from the co-parenting perspective, and it's you and the other parent sort of almost against the kids, right?
The team up.
Yeah. You have to team up because you're forced to work against the teenagers, so to speak. But, as we've talked about on the podcast, the relationship with Emily has been really good, particularly mine and hers, I think, for several years. But obviously this experience of losing Thomas and all that kind of thing has, I think, created a new kind of bond for us. So the one thing I will tell you is that if you don't know this, Thomas's middle name was Darcy, and her and I both call him Darcy. And so we're going to try to stay in Thomas mode. I'm used to doing that with work. Emily's not so used to having to do that. So if we flip into calling him Darcy, you will know that it's all the same person. There's a whole story. It actually involves Emily, but if you want to know that, you can email me and I'll tell you the whole story if you really want to know. That's okay. It's Emily's fault that we're going through that. So I want to back up and kind of talk about, I just kind of want to walk through Thomas and Emily's process. I know you guys have heard Thomas talk about this a lot, and you've heard about his perspective, and I'm going to try to kind of bring that into this episode. But the thing I want Emily to do is kind of give you, from her perspective, what was happening or what her thoughts were as she was going through it. And, one of the reasons I think this is important is because it's real easy for us to get focused on like how difficult we think the other person is, or how we think their perspective is ridiculous. But I find most of the time that other parent feels like they're doing what's in the best interest of the child. Their opinion of what's best is just different than what our opinion is. And that doesn't make one opinion right or wrong. And I think that if you can shift into that mode where you're, at least most of the time, I think people are trying to come from a perspective of what they think is the right thing for their kids. And I know that's not the case in every situation. Sometimes you have different levels of conflict and, all kinds of different high conflict personality disorders and things going on that you're sometimes dealing with. But really, in most circumstances, even in a lot of those cases, it's really about perspective. And so that's the name of this episode today. I'm calling it Perspective, and we're going to talk about this a little bit. You guys mediated in the very beginning.
Yes, that's correct.
And that was actually
I believe that was my idea. I had looked at different methods of divorcing and the cost of those things. And I was very young at the time, so I didn't really have a lot of information. And one of the things that was suggested to me when I went to kind of a divorce support group actually was that mediation could be a way to work through those things without having two attorneys battle it out in court, and save some money and kind of come to our own agreement of what we would do with the kids without having somebody dictate that to us. And at that time, that really sounded like the best route to go. I felt like if he had the space maybe to be able to voice his emotions, because he did tend to be emotional about things,
right,
that it would be easier for him to feel like he'd been hurt, and that might help him instead of feeling like he was behind another attorney and maybe his perspective wasn't acknowledged. Because I felt like that was important to him.
Yeah.
That he felt heard.
Yeah, and I think that's important for a lot of people going through this. I mean, we've done different episodes on, do you want to be heard or do you want to win your case in court? Because the court's not there to hear you.
Right.
And the problem with divorce is that emotional overlay is what blocks people from reaching agreement on things. So you're right, him being heard. And, if you have a good mediator that knows how to do this and has experience at doing it, they know how to make people feel heard and all of those things so that you can get past the emotional stuff and get into what are the issues we really need to resolve.
Right.
And that's always where Thomas and I start with our mediations or I guess that's where I start with my mediations now at this point, but is that top layer of like dealing with the emotional part, because if one person is that blocked emotionally, you can't reach settlement on issues.
Right.
Yeah, you got to be able to deal with it. So you actually did mediate your whole thing. You got through it, but for about the first, from what I recall, I think 2 years, you did not
at least
speak to each other.
Correct. We did not communicate directly with each other unless it was literally written down, essentially is what happened. It came down to like just folders of emails, essentially. And even those weren't always pleasant. Like we went back and forth even in the email.
Right.
Because obviously you lose a lot of nuance in what somebody's saying, and it's all in kind of your head and how you're perceiving the person. And that was actually one of the best things I learned during that period, is that I needed to work on my perspective on Darcy, because if I read everything that he wrote with that negative mindset of like, oh, he's either out to get me or he's against me
or he's controlling
me or any of those things. Any of those things, I felt like we got nowhere fast. The second I was able to kind of remind myself that, look, if I'm doing the best I can at any given moment, maybe he's doing the best he can at any given moment.
Right.
And we were both working through, whatever fallout from the marriage, those emotional fallouts, and just kind of those wounds, I guess, that we had caused in each other. And so kind of learning as we healed from those to try to see the other person. I think, I know for me, I can only speak from my end, but for me to try to see him in the best light possible, to not automatically jump to worst case scenario, this is what he's trying to do, but instead remember who he is. Like, I always say to people these days, Darcy and I weren't a great husband and wife, but we've always been good friends. Like, I don't think he was a great husband to me necessarily, but he's a great father. And so if I can keep that in mind and really understand that's true,
right,
it helped in dealing with these kind of like sticky issues that came up.
Yeah, and he's a good person. He's a good kind person with integrity, and
which I couldn't see at the time, because and vice versa, right? It's that. So it's kind of those concrete things, like, what have I observed? Okay, well, I have observed he's always been a good father, right? The facts are there. He's never been a bad father. So that helped.
Right. At that point, all of our exchanges took place at daycare,
right?
At least in the very beginning. And so Thomas and I actually moved in together. I actually had not met you yet.
Right.
And so I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that, because I think that we have a lot of people with young children. Sometimes you have people who have a 6-month-old, a 3-month-old, a whatever, and that's your baby,
your
right?
Child, yeah.
And for you and Thomas, like, you had struggled with infertility. The boys are adopted, and so you finally had these 2 babies. They're 2 and 1. Now all of a sudden, you're not only sharing them half the time with Thomas, but he's now moved in with somebody that you've never even met. And I think, and just because of the situation between the two of you, where you weren't really talking face to face at that time, I think we lived together about 3 months before you and I actually met face to face. So what was that like for you? Like, just as a mom, and do you remember having any concerns, or was it hard to like know somebody else is caring for your baby, or like, the feelings from that perspective? Because my kids were older, so I've never had that experience of like such a young child.
Okay, that's a good question. I remember the first time I became aware of you was I was looking for divorce support, oddly. And I found you were mediating a group, or you were head of a group or something. I know you were on the internet, because when I pulled it up, the first thing Isaiah said, he was on my lap, he was like, "That's Tammy." And I was like, Tammy who? So that was like my first inkling, like, okay, well, that's weird. So clearly this group is out, but for whatever reason. But I remember being able to read, I think you had a bio or something. You had something. And I remember that was kind of my first introduction to who you were.
I didn't know that.
No,
I don't think you've ever told me that.
I've never said that? Oh, well, surprise.
Yeah, I was in a couple different support groups where I was helping facilitate.
Correct.
Stuff. Yeah.
I remember that. So that's kind of my first introduction to who you were. And And I remember being like, well, all right, I love that. But in terms of being okay, I guess with you helping with the children, there was a transitional period where it was a little bit difficult. And it was more, I think, if I think back on it, it had more to do with my own internal, like giving up control more than
Right.
feeling like maybe you weren't capable as a mother. If
Right.
that makes sense. But also, I think there was a certain part of just for me, the journey I went through to have those children and learning to be okay, sharing them with other people. Obviously, both my children have birth moms that are involved in their lives.
Right.
And so there was a certain amount of learning and growing initially that I had to do just for that. And I think
Right.
that helped enormously
That
in
makes
allowing
sense.
somebody else into their lives. Because for me, I'll tell people, I never see it as a bad thing if more people love my children.
Right.
If there are more people in my children's lives who love them and are invested in them, that's good for me. It's good for them. You know, it's that whole takes a village thing, but I want this village to love my child. Like I love my child.
Right.
And so I feel like a lot of that groundwork had been laid just in my own journey to becoming a parent.
Thomas always talks about this is a piece of his case that he blew.
That first meeting.
That first family court services meeting. Now,
Okay.
the oldest child was about 5,
Mhm.
and we needed to figure out where
Where he's
he
gonna
was
go to
going to
school.
go to school. And so
Mhm.
that was really the impetus for Thomas filing a motion. So Thomas is the one that filed this because I think you guys had emails back and forth
Mhm.
and
we
whatever,
couldn't find
and you just
agreement.
couldn't reach
Mhm.
agreement. So he filed a motion with the court, and then he also at that time filed to modify his support because he had started the business and his income was lower and all that. And I'm not as worried about that piece of it right now, but I want to talk about what happened to your recollection. I know it's been a long time, but
It's been a while.
in family court services, I mean, one of the things Thomas talked about that he did is he said, well, I can't cooperate with her. I can't get along with her. I
He
can't.
did. He did.
You know, and so the counselor was like, not child focused. And one of the things she said in the report, and you might not even remember this, is she said, mother appears more child focused than father. Now, I will tell you that Emily is an extremely child focused person. That's just her personality. Before we started recording, she was in here running around with my grandson, and he was taking up with her more than he does me. So she's just a very child focused person naturally. But I will say that I think Thomas is as child focused as you are.
Absolutely. That's
You
why
know.
it's so interesting that
Yeah.
I remember, that report came out the way it did, because you're right. Obviously Darcy and I spent a lot of time and effort trying to have children.
Right.
It was what we wanted. We
Right.
wanted to have a big family. So he's definitely child focused for sure. But I do remember that, it's funny that you mentioned that because I'd forgotten. That was definitely one of the times that I had gotten advice from somebody in a divorce group. And the number one thing they said is, do not talk bad about the other parent. Keep it focused on the child, and always use terms like our children, our son.
Right.
I believe it'll be in the best interest of the child
Right.
and just try to take all of that emotion out of it. And that's where that part served me well, that I was like, okay, that I can do that. But I know that for Darcy, it was probably very triggering
Right.
to hear me talk like that, simply because it felt so cold.
Well, and also you guys had not had a face-to-face conversation
Not until that point. Correct.
in 3.5 years
Yes,
at that point, right?
correct. Yeah.
And so you're not having any face-to-face. So just being
In the
it's
same room.
in the same room. I always talk
Mhm.
about this, like when you get a divorce, there's something, this was the person you were closest with, right? That you were totally intimate with, that knew everything about you. And so your body almost has a visceral reaction of being in the room with that other person. And so we're in a situation where Thomas hasn't been in the room with her for 3.5 years. First time he sits down is in front of this mediator. He's an extremely emotional guy. All of his emotions start to come out. And most of what that mediator heard is, I'm angry at Emily for divorcing me.
I think that's true.
Right.
I think that is true, because we never had a chance to hash it out. And I think that for better or worse, and in other divorce cases, there's a moment where they have that kind of catharsis of having it out with each other.
Right.
And we purposefully had separated everything up to that point. We only communicated through writing. And so there wasn't any time for any of those emotions to come out with one another. And you're right. It was probably the first time we had been face to face in a room. And then we're discussing this highly volatile situation.
Right.
But I had already been coached to
Right.
hold that back. And I don't think he had been.
Which is weird because he had a coach. I don't know.
I don't know what to
I don't know
tell
who
you.
he was talking to. I don't know if he was working with the coach by then. He had the coach for mediation, but he should have gone back and talked to the
Maybe.
coach before the FCS appointment. So out of that family court services, what one of the things we were really like kind of at odds about is you wanted to homeschool the
Right.
older one, and we wanted him to go to public school. And so one of the disagreements they had is the older one is a little bit more socially challenged, and so Thomas felt like, well, if he goes to public school, that'll kind of throw him into it, and he'll have to like sink or swim. He'll have to learn how to be social. And from Emily's perspective, if I'm recalling correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, was you felt like, well, if we give this child another year to mature, then that social awkwardness may lessen and it may be an easier transition for
Well,
him.
I mean, that's mainly right. I mean, from my perspective, they had already been in that daycare situation and we'd already gotten called in terms of his behavior towards other children. He was very aggressive at that point.
Right.
We were taking him to specialists and stuff. And in my head, I feel like, okay, maybe if we had a year where he doesn't have that stress of being with all these other children and trying to manage all of that and learn how to read or write or any of that stuff, maybe if we can focus, it'll help him have that space. And then we can just socialize him in a more controlled environment.
Right.
Was my thinking on it.
Right. And so this is one of those situations where they just had different perspectives. It's not like they weren't both trying to do the best thing for the child, what they thought was the best thing. They just disagreed about what that best thing was. And I will tell you that I think Thomas had a little bit of fear at that stage, because we're only like 3 years in, that you would have more parenting time and that he would potentially lose parenting time. And, there was some fear of that, because if the child's with you all day, every day.
He didn't trust at that point that I was going to promote the best version of him to
Right.
my child. I
Right.
could see that.
Right.
That makes sense.
Right. So we did the court ruled that, based on the mediator's report that Thomas totally screwed up, the court ruled that the older one be homeschooled, for at least the first year, and that once we started him in public school, then he would go to school in mine and Thomas's school district, which it turns out in retrospect I thought was very what am I trying to say? Like, insightful for that judge. I mean, it was just, and I didn't even realize how insightful until years down the road.
Until you saw
because
where we went
Thomas
with
and I
it.
came out of there feeling like we lost. The
That's
child's
funny,
going to
'cause
be
I felt the same way.
Yeah, the child's going to be home. You felt that too, because we thought we lost because he's going to be homeschooled, and she thought I lost
because he's going straight. He's
because
going
he's going to their district.
He's going to their district.
So it's like he gave each of us a carrot, but also took something away from each of us. And I have this experience so much with the court across the board, where they'll apply things at the same, like financially, they do that a lot. It's like, well, if you say your income's depressed, well, then I'm going to believe the other person's income is depressed. And if I'm going to put you at the highest possible earning, then I'm going to put the other person at the highest possible earning. And they just generally apply things across the board. You don't generally go in and get, oh, this person's going to get the highest amount of income attributed to them, and then the other person's going to be able to say they're the lowest. You don't generally get that kind of application. And so same thing happened in this situation, where he said, okay, I'm going to let mom homeschool, but I'm going to give dad the ongoing district enrollment when the child gets into public school. And so it was kind of weird, but it's funny that you say you felt like you lost too.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah, because that's how we felt about it. But what that year did, I will tell you in retrospect, that probably I think wouldn't have been as likely to happen, is it forged mine and your relationship.
Absolutely. We were forced to have communication
Right.
on all of these issues that we probably wouldn't have discussed had he been in the public school system, just because we had to come to some sort of agreement on everything, really everything regarding this child.
Right. And so you and Thomas still weren't really
weren't talking.
communicating at that point, because emotionally, honestly, he still couldn't handle it. And so it became me and Emily communicating about all the things with the child. And then I think there were a lot of things too that just on the personal side that you and I had a chance to like hash out and understand the other person's perspective that we really hadn't had an opportunity to communicate before. Because Thomas had always been kind of like
separate worlds.
No,
separate
these
worlds,
are separate
worlds.
worlds.
I don't want my worlds to collide.
But once this happened, it was sort of like he either let me interact with her or he had to
do
interact
it.
with you. So it was one or the other. And so he's like, okay, fine, you handle it. And then once he saw that Emily and I were able to navigate that fairly well, then he relaxed a little, I think. And it became a little more like.
And that could be a cultural thing where they always pit the new wife against the old wife
Right.
and stuff. But I feel like I don't know. I don't know if our situation was just unique or there just had been like, I don't know if my perspective was different, but I've never felt in competition with you. And
Right.
I think that's partly my personality and partly how you've handled things. And
Right.
it didn't become a thing.
Right.
I mean, there were issues where we didn't agree on, which
Right.
happens,
Right.
but I never felt like you were trying to overstep or control
Right.
my child. You know?
Right. Right. Yeah. And one of the things that I was real diligent about, at least from my side, for many of those like kind of middle years, like now we're over the hump and everything's been
Mhm.
fine for several years now. We've really had no kind of hiccups or anything for probably at least 6, 7, 8 years, somewhere in there. But in the beginning, obviously, there was very little communication. But those middle transition years, I really tried to be like, what can we do to support you? And I really tried to, when we offered things, not make it like I was trying to, oh, do you want us to transport the kids for football practice? Do you want us to transport? And I really tried to not make it something that's like, oh, I'm just trying to get more parenting time so we can take the kids from you, kind
Mhm.
of thing. And I tried to be careful about how things were presented or worded or, how we did stuff. But I think too, for both households, we both had our own, like Thomas and I, we had my kids, right? And then we also had, once my kids were gone, our own individual time, which we liked.
Yeah.
You have a whole nother
Had a
family
whole,
built in
yeah.
your world. So there were things that it was like life was easier sometimes when the
were
children would go
elsewhere.
with the other.
Right.
Yeah, I can remember the kids leaving, especially the older one who's a little more, like I said, socially challenged and has some issues. There are times that the level of attention and parenting he would require would be so exhausting. And I'd already been through it with 2 other boys, but this boy is a unique boy.
Yes.
And so there are times when he would go back to your house and I would literally like lay down and just sleep for like 2 days because I'm like,
I believe that.
Thank God he's going to Emily's. I gotta get him some rest.
You just need to recharge for the next time. And
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely, I mean, I love my son.
Yeah,
obviously.
of course.
Obviously, we love
love
him. But yes, he was a little bit challenging there. Can still be challenging. And so, yes, I think you're right. I mean, even with my 2 children that had all of the time with me, just that space to then not have to focus solely on him
Right.
was helpful.
Right. Right. And it gives you some energy to put towards the other children, and which,
Mhm.
we had also on our end with my kids. And then after my kids were gone, time to just like forge the relationship more and be alone and have all those kind of things. So there are benefits if you can start to kind of enjoy the benefits that come with the children going, with the other parent. I think it's helpful. It's like,
You learn to love your alone time.
yes, you do. Thomas used to call Emily a very expensive babysitter. That's what he used to say.
That's probably true. I'm not going to disagree with that. It was probably
that
true.
was his joke. That's what he would always say to me. So, okay. So I hope this has been interesting. I mean, I'm hopeful that this will be kind of a regular thing where I can have Emily on to kind of talk about some different perspectives like this. And, she's been through her own thing with these 2 children with Thomas, and she's been through a round of it with her other 2 children. And so there's, you have a lot of perspective, from there's a lot of
Yes.
challenges you have in your second set
Yeah.
that you didn't have in your first set because Thomas is different than the second husband. And so maybe
Entirely. Yes.
yes. So maybe we'll dig into that at some point because
Well, and to be fair, the relationship forged here was such an asset and benefit in terms of, like, I mean, my girls love Darcy
right.
or Thomas.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, it's okay.
I'll get it.
Yeah, it's
But
okay.
they love him, right?
Right.
I mean, they're heartbroken
Right.
about what's happened, and
Yeah.
so to know that that we've done, not to pat ourselves on the back and be like we've done amazing, but to know that we've worked hard enough to create this kind of like unusual family unit,
Right.
But there's real love there. Like
Yeah.
there's a concern there. And
Right.
again, it's never a bad thing for me to feel like more people love my children.
Yeah.
So that was helpful.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this. I mean, like I said, this occurrence with Thomas passing has obviously created a new bond between me and him. A deeper bond, I should say, is probably the right word. But it's sort of like I don't have any siblings, but I feel like it's what it would like to have a sister, with having you here. So it's been helpful. Yeah, so I mean, you don't know what you're going to go through down the road, and I can tell you that neither one of us saw this coming at all. We never dreamed that this would happen. But honestly, Emily's probably been the most supportive person through all of this. You know, she went to the funeral home with me to make arrangements and all these different things that if you had told me 17 years ago that I would be going with Thomas's ex-wife to make his funeral arrangements, I would say you're insane, because they didn't even speak at that point.
Right.
So, you know, you can overcome a lot of things with time and patience. So if you are watching this on YouTube, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you get notified as new videos come out each week. If you're listening to us in Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, any of those places, please rate and review it. Also, and subscribe so that you know as new episodes are released each week. And if you've particularly liked this episode, I'd love to have feedback from you on the YouTube channel, on the podcast. You can always email me at tammy@divorceuniversityonline.com. My first name is spelled Tammy. If you guys want to hear more of me and Emily together and that type of thing, I'd love to have the feedback and how you liked this episode. So I will see you next week.
We'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon. Turn